Okay, welcome to episode 130 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Marc Azoulay. Marc is the founder of Men's Therapy Online, a community and healing hub for men who want to get back on their feet or take their lives to the next level. With the help of his team of licensed clinicians, he provides ongoing men's groups, individual counseling, and powerful wilderness retreats to his members. He has a background in psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and Buddhism. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you. Happy to be on the show.
It was just reading through before I began the psychoanalysis, the neuroscience, and Buddhism, and I'm like, oh, I love all of those areas. So I'm sure we'd have a fascinating conversation today.
hmm Yeah, I,
So,
I like those because they all connect with the idea of the unconscious. You know,
mm,
they all point at the same thing, and that's a big part about how I work is helping guys to understand their unconscious motivators.
yeah, I think it's so important. It's like we shared before we began. I work a lot with leaders.
hmm
And I find if we don't deal with the unconscious, it's a bit like we've got our foot down on the brake and we're going, I can't move forward in life. And it's like, yeah, you've got to look at the unconscious to remove your foot off the brake.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I
Mm.
think especially with leaders, I mean, we can just dive in here, but like especially with leaders is like if you have that unconscious part, right, a childhood part that was wounded. I know you talk about like boarding school, right? And imagine people are coming up in that and they get wounded, they get hurt, they get emotionally traumatized. And then that part is just craving power because it
Mhm.
felt so powerless. And then now you have a leader, right, that, maybe they get a big break, they get a big promotion, they get elected to a public office, and that unconscious part can start to take control very quickly because it's just been waiting. It's been waiting until it feels powerful to be able to enact what it wants.
Yeah, that's so true. Nick Duffel, who wrote Wounded Leaders, he says it's the little
Mhm.
boys inside of them who are in charge.
Exactly, exactly that, right? You have like these leaders that then, yeah, they just want, I mean, underneath it, they want love, right? That they want belonging, they want things that all humans want. They want connection, they want their lives to matter. But then I do think it comes out in very controlling ways for most people if they don't work on their unconscious, if they don't understand that little boy and what he needs and try to feed him early, before he becomes starving and starts to take instead of, receive.
Yeah. Well, how I love to begin the podcast, Mark, is just you to share a little bit about your journey. How did you get into this work of working with men's therapy online?
Certainly, yeah, I know. I was kind of just jumping into the topics there, but
Oh, it's good. I like it.
excited. But yeah, so my story, you can dive into whatever parts you want in detail. I'll give the overview. But very long story short, basically, grew up in a stable household, but a very emotionally dissociated household. A lot of conflict, a lot of emotional abuse, some physical abuse. We were, middle class, so we were taken care of, but there wasn't much love or there was love in the terms of like buying things and creating stability, but there wasn't really love in terms of like, emotional connection. And I grew up really shut down and quiet, really shy, really low self-esteem. I was bullied in school. So, I was bullied in school, bullied in my house. So I just like really never felt safe. And I, ended up developing such low self-esteem. I was suicidal for a while, and I really just hated who I was. I was overweight, I was shy, I was shut down. I was a nerd, and I grew up in like rural Maryland, and I liked Dungeons and Dragons and Magic cards, and everyone there was like sports and army, so very 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 different. So I went to college, and I did what most young men do that are in that situation, is I tried to reinvent myself. I was like, hey, I hated who I was for basically my whole life. I'm going to become a new person. And this person that I generated was what an 18-year-old thinks is cool, which is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So I got into the punk scene, I got into the EDM, rave scene. I started doing a lot of drugs. I started selling a lot of drugs. I tried to hook up as many women as possible. But underneath that, I was still just a little boy, like I had no experience, I had no confidence, and I was kind of falling victim to a version of toxic masculinity in that I could never say no to anything. So when people were passing around, cocaine, I was like, yeah, I've done cocaine tons of times. When I was with a girl, I was always pushing forward to try to hook up or get laid because I didn't want to ever look weak. So I ended up saying yes to everything. That culminated in a drug overdose. which kind of woke me up to this whole thing, being like, oh my God, this is not sustainable. So I got into therapy as a client, working first in my counseling center. I went to Carnegie Mellon University. That's the neuroscience part of the bio. So I was studying neuroscience at the time. I went to the college counseling center. That in many ways saved my life. And then I kind of started to recover. And a big part of my recovery was mindfulness. So I went to the Allegheny Zen Center. Now we're on the Buddhism piece, right? So I studied
Mhm.
Zen Buddhism intensely. I did a Datun, which is like a 3 month long meditation retreat. Following that, I went to Naropa University, which is a Buddhist university out in Boulder, Colorado. So I got my master's in Buddhist psychology, and then studied psychoanalysis after that in New York City for a 3 year program. But even though I got sober, I went through this recovery process. What I found is really at the core of my struggles personally was my idea of masculinity. I love my dad, and he was a great model, but he never really told me or taught me what it meant to be a man. I didn't have a lot of mentors growing up. I had to find them later in life. I didn't really have a lot of good male friends. A lot of us were just a lot of lost boys, from Peter Pan kind of thing.
Mhm.
So I found that that was really my core issue, is that I didn't have a pathway, and I was trying to invent it myself. Like I said, as like an 18-year-old trying to build what it meant to be a man. And it wasn't until I started, reading some of these books, getting in touch with, some mentors, going back through ancient history and seeing what men have been talking about for, centuries, if not millennia, that I started to have some more of a path. And then men's therapy online is just that. I mean, what I like about being a business owner is I can just make a business that I need, or that I needed at the time, and that I can talk about things that I'm passionate about. So I'll pause there because that's a very long story with a lot of different rabbit holes if you're interested in digging into any of it.
Yeah, no, some of my introductions that people have given have lasted an hour, so that's quite a short one. So, no, that's really interesting. Um, thank you for sharing your story, and I think what we st shared before we began, the importance of vulnerability and us sharing, because I think when we do, I think I always see this with humans for myself is part of my wounding is judgment, judging people as better than me or worse than me. When I hear someone's story, they become human. Move up to the, you know, no better, no worse. And as you share your story, I can relate. One, I spent time in a Buddhist monastery for a few years. That was part of my recovery. And then the
Nice.
drink and drugs and self-harm and suicide attempts. And I hear this a lot from people who've maybe been through struggles in childhood, how that then manifests in their 20s and 30s. Because we almost, yeah, we don't have those role models, what it's like to be authentic men and women.
Yeah, exactly. In the Buddhist thing, and I'm curious what your experience of it was. Like, mind, I talk about the unconscious and the shadow a lot. So as I tell my story, there's kind of, there's a conscious version, then the unconscious version, right?
Mm.
And I think for me, the conscious version was this search for meaning, a search for spirituality. When I was in AA and going through early recovery, I struggled making a higher power, connecting to a higher power. But for
Mm.
me, it was the present moment, right? So Buddhism was kind of the thing. I was like, I don't know about God, I don't know about any deities, but like at least I can be here and present. And I like the idea of living a life without stress, which is what I thought Buddhism was. It's not, but that's what I thought it was back in the day. And the unconscious motivator, and this is what I'm curious in your story too, is like I just wanted to strip everything down. I think I had gotten to a point where the flywheel was just running so quickly, with the bullying, with the drugs, with the alcohol, with like the women, with all the stuff in my life. It was just like so much noise and confusion that I was really drawn to, Zen Buddhism in particular, which is just like sit down and shut up, basically. You just stare at like a white wall and you wear black robes and you just do nothing. It's very, very, very boiled down. Eat the same thing for 3 months in a row and, rake some leaves. And I really needed that. I think I needed like a full pause in my life, just like a full, just kind of just slam on the emergency brake and try to stop. Um, so I'm curious for you, like what your draw to Buddhism and spirituality was, or still is, if you still practice.
Yeah, I still practice. I have my shrine behind me there. Yeah, what drew me? I think it was I was a mess. Uh,
Me too.
people say,
Yeah.
"Oh, you're really lucky." I'm like, well, actually, no, I was kind of almost homeless and struggling with basically feeling mentally very unwell. And I'd been off to Africa for a year, and I knew that I needed a break, a bit like you, just to take my, get out of that flywheel. And so it was just the synchronicities, that Jungian thing, meeting people who'd lived in monasteries, and they say, "Oh, you should speak to this person." I'd speak to them, and it just doors opened, and then suddenly I'm going to visit a monastery to help cook for 10 days. I ended up staying for over 1,000 days, ordaining as a novice monk. And then, once I got that safety, that's when I fell apart. All of the stuff, my childhood trauma, the sexual abuse, that then surfaced, and it got really messy for a number of years. Self-harming, suicide attempts, but it was like the safe container of the Buddhism, not being judged. I spoke to one of my friends who's now well, I think he was an abbot, but one of my Buddhist, the ones I lived with, spoke to him this morning, and it was just non-judgmental. They just were there for me, and I'd never had that before. So that was mine. I mean, what was your experience like? 3 months
Yeah.
in the Zen monastery.
Yeah, I mean, similar, right? I mean, as you're thinking, yeah, I'm just feeling a lot of connections there. It's like yeah, I think the unconscious or God, if you're spiritual religious, like they give us what we're ready for, and that's what I'm hearing in your story, right? It's the idea that, once you were able to settle down and be in that safe, non-judgmental place, then of course all the trauma comes rushing back. And yeah, I think for listeners, if they're going through that, like keep going is what I would say to
Mm.
them, right? Because I think it can be really scary. I think especially for men to all of a sudden have these memories come back, and feelings come back, and emotions come back. And yeah, I had a very similar experience. For me, it was it was funny because I went through this 3 month thing, right? And again, consciously, I don't think I realized this, but unconsciously, there's no drugs allowed in the monastery. So like that was my rehab. I like went through like detox there. And not only did I go through, yeah, of course, all those like memories coming up, I also went through like physical detox and withdrawal there, and needing to like showing how I had to keep it together and my own views about masculinity and being, a proper nice guy. That was thrown in my face. Um, I also kind of went through this idea of kind of going back in time and realizing why I started doing a lot of those drugs. I mean, I started smoking weed when I was like 14 years old, and just like really getting in touch with that part that I had left behind, in that shadow. And it was just a lot of grieving. I think for me, it was a lot of grief. It was a lot of mourning. It was a lot of just spontaneously crying. That kicked off, of course, me being a therapy client. And I remember for my first 2 years in therapy, I cried almost every session. There was just so many tears that I didn't shed when I was a kid that just started like pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring out, from all those times where I just had to kind of keep it together for my family. You know?
Mm. Mm. Thank you. Yeah, again, I can resonate with the tears. I think I hadn't cried. I think one of the key things of coming out of boarding school, which I think links into leadership,
Yeah.
is that you're taught in these institutions to not show emotion. Whether you're a boy or a girl, it's like you will be shamed, or you will be beaten, or something will happen if you show any. So you learn to squash and squash. And I hadn't cried for 15 years, not even when my father died or friends died. It was like, no, you can't show emotion. And everyone's like, this is a very British thing. Oh, you're so strong. And it's like, no, I'm just dissociated, which I now
Yeah.
know. I'm just dissociated. And then the tears started to come. And likewise, I cried nearly every day for 2 years. And it felt very similar to you that I stopped drinking. My last drink was the day before I got to the monastery. And that's 23 years ago. I've not had a drink since. And so very similar, the detox was the monastery. So really felt like that. So yeah, I can resonate on so many levels. And I think what's the importance for men and women for us to grieve. I mean, tears.
Yeah. I mean, I think we need that. And I know Western culture, right? I mean, certainly American culture, I imagine British culture, it's so production focused. It's so go, go, go. It's so future
Mhm.
focused. And I think that's created, some good things in the world and it's created a lot of ambition, but we very rarely look back. And what I see with a lot of the guys I work with, and I have to imagine with the men you work with as well, is that they feel empty. Their lives are devoid of meaning because they never take a time to feel anything.
Mhm.
And what I see for a lot of men, that's the avoidance of grief. And we were talking about some of the archetypical, men stuff, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with Iron John by, Robert Bly. And that talks about the wild man, but at the end, he also talks about the grieving man being another archetype. And he writes about that in some later books. But this idea of if you don't if you don't grieve, then nothing matters. Nothing you're not attached to anything. You don't connect with anything. And I think grief is hard for men because we're taught that we can fix everything. And that, spirals out into loneliness and isolation and, this kind of toxic masculinity stuff that we'll dive into. But, on the grief point, it's like because we're so avoidant of just feeling that it sucks, just feeling that we just have simply lost something, we just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. Because I think for all of us, we have lost things, whether it's that perfect childhood, whether it's, a friend or a family member, whether it's a job, whether it's the fantasy of a perfect spouse or a happy family. Like I think as men, we are losing things constantly, but we're still in this world. I think you and I are trying to change that narrative, but I think for most men, they're in the world where to grieve is to be weak. Is like, and I see so many of my guys be like, oh yeah, well, I didn't care about that anyway. I didn't care about it. It's fine. Just as a way to avoid grief versus being like, it's okay to care about wanting a happy family. It's okay to care about your mother that passed away when you were young. Like it's fine. But we're so dismissive, I feel like, in Western culture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That dissociation.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
love Stephen Joseph's book, What Doesn't Kill Us, which is all about post-traumatic growth instead of
Mhm.
post-traumatic stress disorder. And you might have seen this, but a couple of months ago, my wife passed away, and I really the kind of the thing I learned was about leaning into it, that approaching. In the past, I would have avoided, just worked really hard. This time it was like, oh no, just need to really be in this and grieve. And I just, yeah, spent the first month just crying. And now I still cry most days, but it's almost like in the past, I would have just walled it up.
Mhm.
And now it's just a river. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, I can feel this, and this is grief, and it's normal. This is part of the human experience. Most indigenous traditions have someone in the community who will support people who are grieving. They're called I don't know if they're called the criers or the grievers, and you go and see them, and they'll cry with you. We don't have that in the West.
We don't have that. Yeah. I'm sorry I did not know about your wife, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My condolences there. And
Mm.
I think it's beautiful is the way you're talking about it. And I hope the listeners can really, dive into that of like riding the wave, like you said. This idea that like grief is love continuing, you know? I think there's some ideas where people say, oh, grief is like what you pay for love. And I think that just frames it as negative
Yeah.
versus like this is how love transforms and like it still is soft and tender and beautiful. And there is power in grief, and there is like meaning in grief. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, it's almost like the flip side of the grief is it's the same hand, it's the love, it's the joy. But if we won't feel the grief, then we don't feel the joy. And I found that the waves of real sadness and then feel, so much joy and love in my heart. And I so agree with that. If we can reframe it, and I almost feel it's the inner critic which comes in, which tries to go, don't cry, because it's my dad's voice or, the bully's voice. Um, what do you find with someone who comes to you who is struggling to cry or connect to that grief? What do you suggest, offer them? What's a practice which is good for connecting to
Yeah, so
grief?
kind of two things. I think the first we were talking about a little bit is the mindfulness, right? It's like really slowing down. I find that so many men in particular are very highly revved, whether it's through overwork or through over caffeination or through over exercise. And it's like there just logistically is often not room for grief in many men's lives. They have that inner critic voice and they have these responsibilities and commitments that they built for themselves through their career or their family or their hobbies. And they just don't, they like do not slow down. They're constantly running and running and running and running. And so the first thing is just creating space for that grief. The next one, and this is kind of what we do a lot at MTO, is do these like kind of masculine reframes for kind of tried and true therapy concepts because we find that a lot of men don't, resonate with therapy language. Understandably, I think it's a very feminine way of speaking, and for men that are new to it, they struggle. So, one reframe that we talk about is legacy. A lot of men connect with legacy. So when you
Mhm.
get a guy talking about his legacy and legacy of that person that they've lost, and say, hey, your father died when you were young. What about him do you want to live on in you? And can you practice it? Maybe you really liked that he was a leader at work. Maybe you liked that he was handy around the house. Maybe you have memories playing, football or soccer together, right? It's like starting to do those things, I think starts to bring the grief back. I think men are we're very kinetic and we're very physical in the way that we process things. So if we like feel by doing in a way,
Mhm.
so once you have a guy that starts to practice those legacy components, then the feelings often follow that.
Mm, thank you. Well, one of the things I found most powerful, and I know you do a lot of men's circles, is when we're in a group of men or women or mixed, often I found that's when grief can come to the surface. I did a men's, put it into context, I did a men's circle at a men's festival called Menfest, which now Men's Nation in the UK. And there was about 100 and 150 men there. And I did a circle around boarding school, and there was 20 men who came, and nearly all of us were in tears at one point or another, sharing our stories because so many had similar stories, and it just built. And we were sat on the earth, we were in a yurt. It was just really healing. And some people said, I haven't cried for ages. How do you find that container of having a group around you who have similar experiences, who are being authentic, vulnerable?
That's the thing, right? I mean, that is the thing. That is the antidote, is community and connection. And it's just the idea of being like, hey, like me too, like I've also felt that. And I think there is something, beautiful and kind of dark that everyone will experience grief. I think that is in some ways the most universal emotion. Not everybody may get the opportunity to experience love or experience joy or experience success or triumph, but grief like comes for everybody. It's like death, right? Death comes for everybody. So I think that is often a very, very unifying emotion. And like you said, with indigenous cultures, having these like grief ceremonies and criers and things like that was part of it. Where if you look at most cultures, it's, if you look at Latin American culture and the Day of the Dead, right? Or in Scandinavian culture, they have ancestor worship and honoring, right? Like cultures have this. And in America, we've turned it into Halloween, where you dress up as like your favorite character from movies and like you try to get laid, like it's been perverted in a way. But like having death rituals and grief rituals have been part of humanity for such a long time. And that's all done in community, like you're saying. It's all done in people sharing stories. And I'm Jewish, and Jewish tradition, we light candles, and then when we sit Shiva, where we are held by our community for about 2 weeks, and those are powerful things. And I think it's also a way to kind of go back to that masculine language of that legacy component, like keeping these people alive through story. Humans are storytellers. So if we can sit in a circle and tell stories about the people that we've lost, or about the fantasies that we've lost, or about the pain that we've endured, it helps us process and create like a linear meaning out of it instead of it just being this kind of emotional soup. Now we have a story, we have something that we can share and package and deliver and hopefully inspire others and touch others through too. So
Mhm.
yeah, men's circles for them, really. Like the more of those we get, the better, the healthier society we're gonna have.
Yeah, yeah. There's uh, a colleague, a friend, client of mine set up with a few others this group that meets. a few times a week to do circles around boarding schools, and it's been seen and heard. They found it connection circles. They found it so powerful. People sharing stories. I think for a lot of us, because whether it's boarding school or whether it's some other form of trauma, we've never spoken up. And therefore, to hear someone else talk, one, you might have forgotten what actually happened because you've dissociated. So hearing someone else, you're like, oh my God, that happened to me too. But then also, it's that common humanity, like you've just said. It's like, oh wow, yeah, I also went through that, and feeling like we're not alone anymore.
Yeah. Well, and I can imagine in boarding schools, particular because we're talking a little before about how many people that go there end up being very successful and have these high status positions, you know. But
Mm.
it's a mask, I'd imagine, for many of them where they just are playing this role and they're in this world of competition and success and status. So to be able to walk into a men's circle and take that mask off is powerful. I mean, I remember, you know, some of my first AA groups, right? You know, I was in the room with doctors and lawyers and professors, as well as, homeless people and, single parents. And like, we were all on the same level. And for me, as like a student, like a really insecure child, it was powerful to be able to get the respect of, a doctor or a lawyer and to have that not matter and have like the titles not matter because we were all just, people in that moment. And I think men, again, especially Western culture, is so hierarchical and so competitive. So to be able to have a men's circle where it's just about being you is unbelievably healing. To not have to fight and play that game even for 90 minutes that the group takes place in. It is very relieving and healing for guys.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, I like what you say about taking the mask off. I think that's certainly something we did at school. Immediately you put the mask on, that collective mask of, okay, no emotion. Okay, got to look as if I'm successful or I know what I'm doing. And actually, if we can take it down and just go, yeah, this is me. Because we're almost forced into being something that we're not.
Yeah, like in boarding school, I'm just curious, like, okay, were there spaces where people could be vulnerable or in the modern version, is there more of that? Or is it kind of
Mm.
always performance all the time?
No, it's performance. I
Yeah.
mean, uh, if you cried, usually you were laughed at. I mean, the first time I cried was probably 3 weeks after I'd been there, and it was an open dormitory, 30 boys in my dormitory. Came in just into, I had a cubicle but no door,
Mm.
and they came in shouting, "Ah, you're weak, you're pathetic, you're not so tough now, Cross." And that was my experience. I remember sat crying at my desk going, this will never happen again. And I learned to dissociate. Now, have they changed? They've changed in that, you know, the teachers now, and it might sound strange, but the problem in the past was the teachers didn't have any DBS, which we call is kind of police checks. So
Mm.
there were quite a lot of paedophiles. Now that's a lot more secure. So they have changed. But what I'm hearing from schools now is that they are still really competitive, and they do 80, 90-hour weeks. So the kids are just burning out. There is no space, and emotion isn't really given space for. They have these therapists, but it's seen as a weakness to go and see a therapist,
Okay. Yeah.
and you don't want to be weak. So, yeah, they've definitely changed, but you know, for me, leadership's all about emotional intelligence. And I'm talking about this a lot in my podcast at the moment. These schools teach IQ. And as Daniel Goleman points out, it's just 20% IQ of our life successes. Well, the other 80% is EQ. And therefore, I personally don't want a leader in charge who's only at 20% capability. I want, someone who's really emotionally intelligent. And these schools don't offer that,
Mhm.
because they break the attachment with parents, and therefore that's relationships aren't important.
Yeah. Yeah, that's rough, man. I mean, yeah, it sounds similar to the military. I work with a lot of, veterans and first responders, and it's
Mm.
like, yeah, the structures are there. Like there are therapists on base,
Mm.
but the culture hasn't caught up, right? The internal culture hasn't caught up. Where yeah, you're still a pussy if you go and talk to the shrink, or
Yeah.
if someone sees you and you miss, muster because you're, depressed, you're just down the totem pole. It's
Mhm.
yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on that because you said you've done men's work, you've done men's circles, you've done, retreats and workshops and things, and it's like me too. I've seen men like you give them just the smallest taste of this vulnerability stuff we're talking about
Mhm.
and this connection and this camaraderie, and they just like eat it up.
Yeah.
Like I found in my work, like getting guys to show up is really hard, but once
Yeah.
they're there, they keep coming back over and over and over again. Like they really
Mhm.
want it. And I guess I have this like fantasy or false nostalgia or something for like this structure of like I think it is powerful to have young men come together and be guided by older men, and you would
Mm.
think boarding school would be a place where that could happen. You could have the kind of like Dead Poet Society, kind of experience or something, right? But like it's
Mm.
not. It sounds like it's not that, but like it could be, right? I don't know. It seems like
Well,
it
well, I mean,
could
look at
be,
the Dead Poets Society. That's essentially a boarding school.
right?
And what happens to the character at the end? He commits suicide,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's typical. I mean, in my school, one of my friends committed suicide, so it's quite common
yeah.
that happens. And I think, yeah, I think you're right. It's like a rite of passage. I'm part of the Mankind Project,
Hmm.
and so I think a rite of passage. I Last year I took my godson off to a rites of passage. He was 16, and it was really powerful. A group of men holding space for a group of teenagers. It was either uncles or godfathers, or it wasn't their fathers who were there with them, and it was so powerful for them, very transformational for both the adults and the boys. But I think we then have to go back home. Whereas what the boarding schools do is they take the child away, but they never take them home. So it's like they never come home. A bit like in Vietnam, people didn't come home. They abandoned them out there almost, or they, didn't deal with the post-traumatic stress that they're carrying, and they just, well, you deal with it. And I think that's what happens in these institutions. I think, yes, in principle, if it's a benevolent rite of passage, whereas a lot of these are malevolent rites of passage, in that you're shamed, you're basically told emotions aren't held, and it's the other boys or the other girls who are doing the initiating. There's only one adult for 50 children. It's the other children who are initiating, and that's not a good thing.
Lord of the Flies, right? I
It
imagine.
is, I heard that yesterday, someone talk about that. It's
Yeah,
just like Lord of the Flies. It
yeah.
is, you
Well,
know.
and that was kind of my experience, right? Coming up in the, world of addicts and the rave scene and the punk scene that I was talking about, right? It was just like a
Mhm.
bunch of really lost kids.
Mhm.
And we were just, yeah, hazing each other, bullying each other, sleeping with each other, creating all kinds of drama. Like it was madness. And, no one ever thought to ask, like, where are the adults? I mean, we were so anti-parents, right? We were so anti-adults at that time. And we were also in our 20s, so we thought we were geniuses. We thought we had everything figured out, right? But like, we're not, we're just idiots, right? But like, yeah, that's just a question. And I see that time and time again with the men I work with is like, where were the adults? And, you know, traumatized, dissociated, overworking. I mean, all the things, especially when you look at that, boomer generation or even the greatest generation, you look at, war veterans and Holocaust survivors. It's like we we lost a generation there.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tools. What are some of the tools that you've come across, Mark, in your work, which really helps to, maybe to begin with the unconscious, to reconnect us to those things that, okay, yeah, my foot's on the brake, or I keep doing the same thing, keep doing the same pattern. What are some of the tools that you use in your therapy or in your coaching?
Certainly, yeah. So we've talked about kind of the two big ones, which is, mindfulness and community, right?
Mhm.
Men's circles, meditation practice, just to see what's going on. I think as far as very practical tools, I find a lot of guys get a lot of benefit from writing down dialogues. So writing between the two different parts of themselves. And that brings that, self-sabotage part, or, it's called part X in some communities, right? Or that, kind of dark shadow part to light. And I think, again, guys, we're intense. We're intense people. So giving them the permission to, in their writing, to curse, to use slurs, to be as mean to themselves as their voice is. And I do find that it often takes a male therapist or a male coach to bring that out because a lot of men hide that stuff from women. I think we hide our deepest, darkest demons from women. We try to protect them from that. So that the hate, as much hate as many men carry around, or lust that many men carry around, we keep that. So working with an older man is almost critical because you got to go all the way down into the swamp. So I have guys that are writing out, and it's like the nastiest, meanest stuff that you've ever seen. It is so brutal, and that starts to show how much they're pushing on that brake pedal, like you're saying. All that energy that's being spent either haranguing themselves or defending against that abuse that's going on in their own head. So I think, yeah, getting into a dialogue is really helpful. I find also for guys when I do retreats, we do a lot of what's called psychodrama, which is this idea of you kind of act out an issue that you're going through. So I'll share a quick story to help kind of, you know, um,
Please.
make this real. So I had one client who actually was from South Africa and he played rugby, and he had a lot of negative thoughts about himself, right? So I had, all the other men, so it's a retreat with like, 8 men, right? And then him. So all the other men created like a line, like a linebacker line. And he
Mhm.
assigned every single man there one of the negative things he says about himself, like, you're unsuccessful, you have a small penis, nobody loves you, you're too short, whatever, right? Like, remember that time in 8th grade where you did that stupid thing with that girl, right? Like all the shame, right?
Mhm.
And then his goal was to punch through that line, was to like physically go through the line as the men are yelling the thing that he gave them, you know, to really kind of somaticize and just kind of lock in, what he goes through in his head every day, right? So he has to go and punch through that. And if you're with a group of men that respect each other, they're not going to make it easy. Like they're not going to give up because you're going to know, right? Like if you're punching that line, you're going to know if they're like, oh no, you got me, right? So like it was a battle. It was a battle. And like there was a moment where he almost gave up. And for him, he was a faith-based individual. So for him, his like, belief in Jesus Christ and the Bible actually got him back up, right? So he called on that and he punched through again and he finally got through. And by the end, he's sweating. Like, it was hard, he's sweating, he's in tears. And all of a sudden, I think that the mind does this is beautiful. He's not even talking about that. He's talking about his divorce that he went through. Something else kind of bubbles up to the surface. Now he's crying about, how he misses his ex and how, all the mistakes that he made and how his shame, sabotaged his relationship. Like it just kind of broke through into this whole new way of being for him. Um, and I think for things like that, again, as men, we are very physical. We're very combative. We're very like rough and tumble in many ways. So to have, and I imagine in boarding school, right? Like to have these kind of like they're not hazing experiences, but just like very intensive physical experiences. But then, and you were saying this earlier, like to be held in a community of men after and process that is powerful. And we do groups after that where, we call him protagonist, right? So the guy who was punching through a line, protagonist gets to speak, but also the people that were in the line are speaking. Because for some of them, it might be triggering or difficult for them to be yelling these negative things or to, fight somebody that's coming at them. But I find like, yeah, really getting into the performative aspect and getting into the physicality of it helps move emotions in men. We're not typically not able to access emotions just through talking. I think we need kind of a jackhammer, especially in the beginning when we're very dissociated and disconnected from that whole emotional world.
Mm, that's great. Yeah, I've experienced that quite a lot in the men's work I've done, the psychodrama and yeah, it's interesting. As soon as you said South African rugby, I'm like, he probably went to boarding school because you know, I've spoken to a couple of people the last week who went to a Southern African boarding school, and yeah, it's just it's fascinating that these pockets of people are all across the world. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's really fascinating. So yeah, anything else that tools? You've got psychodrama, you've got mindfulness, you've got community.
Yeah, talk to other people. I mean, I think it's also helpful. for a lot of guys, this is maybe where they could start actually, is to just write a timeline of their life,
Mm-hmm.
which again
Mm-hmm.
seems very basic, but we were chatting a little bit earlier in the program of how so future focused men are and how we're trained to be that we never go back and try to put our lives together. So, I guess two levels as I'm talking out loud now. So, like level one would be just write the timeline, try to go by year, especially if you're somebody who, maybe went through a divorce. Your parents were divorced, or you moved around a lot, or you changed schools, or you experienced grief as a young child. Like, try to really like place that, go back with adult eyes and be like, what happened to me? Because I think as kids, our mind is very fragmented and it's non-linear. But as adults, we can go and be like, oh, wow, like I had three people die in the span of 2 years. That's crazy. Or like, did we really move schools like four times during elementary school? Like that's nuts. Like you don't really think about that until you do it. Um, and then level two, and I have this, some of my guys do this, is tracking emotions throughout that. So
Mm-hmm.
again, with men being very, mathematical and very literal, I have them draw a graph. So one that a lot of guys track is trust, trust in the world, right? Or love, maybe it's another way of saying that. And like, yeah, as a kid, you could see where your love level was 10, and then as these things happen, the love level just goes down and down and down and down and down. And I see that a lot with men that dissociate, which is most of us, is like when we get hurt, in relationship, for instance, we build a wall, right? And we're like, okay, no one is ever going to get this close again. Like I let someone get this close, whether that's my mom or my first, partner or my best friend or my pet, and then you lose that person and you're like, okay, walls up. So like every relationship after that can only go so deep. And then of course, when that one fails or the person dies or whatever, right? Like another wall gets built. And fast forward to your 40s and 50s, and your relationships can only be so shallow, right? Because those walls keep getting built over and over again. So being able to track that and map that is really powerful for a lot of men, because then you can go back and you can say, hey, this is exactly when I built that wall. What does it look like to take that down and to maybe trust and let somebody else in at that level? So many men are so lonely. And it's not because we don't have access to people. I mean, some men struggle with that, but I think most guys, we have access to people. You can find people, but it's that we are just not open to actually connecting with them because of all those walls and defenses that we've built because of that unprocessed grief and pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can so resonate with the walls. I think it's like it keeps us safe, or we think it keeps us safe, but actually it keeps us in pain because we want connection. Again, it's kind of one of the leading issues for leaders and CEOs nowadays is isolation. They feel totally isolated. And, but if we've got those walls up, that's certainly one of the key things we did at boarding school was we put a wall up and Joy Shavrian who wrote Boarding School Syndrome, she says it's like this carapace.
Mhm.
We put this wall up, and I remember thinking I've got an exoskeleton around me, and it just keeps people away. And I had people comment about me saying you're quite cold or you keep people away, and that was it, the wall. How do we start to dismantle these walls that we put up, Mark?
So the shitty answer, which is true, is like you got to start getting hurt again,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Right? Like a metaphor with a lot of my guys is this idea of like the trust fall, and it's like you maybe did that in grade school or something where you fall and your friends catch you, right? But sometimes they don't catch you, right? And sometimes you just like hit the ground and it hurts. And then just like you're saying, as a man, our first reaction is like, okay, well, I'm just never gonna trust them to catch me again. I'm never going to do a trust fall, or if I have to jump, I'm gonna make sure that I have, my parachute, and I have to make sure I have something to land on. I'm gonna handle it myself, right? There's so many men like I'm gonna handle it myself. I don't need other people, right? That's kind of how we're conditioned to be raised, which creates a lot of loneliness, of course, right? So the the hard thing is like to just start doing the trust fall, start really jumping and hoping that people catch you. And when they don't, because no one's 100%. I think that's also another fantasy of like fairy tale relationships, like no one's 100%. People will disappoint you. That is actually what makes you stronger, is being like, okay, like you didn't catch me, but I'm still going to keep jumping because 9 times out of 10, you do catch me. And what that looks like practically, right, is like being messy, like showing other people your feelings, asking other people for help, which a lot of men struggle with, even in something very practical, like, hey, can you, I don't know, fix lunch for me today or something, right? Um, it can look like, you know, doing community activities and like doing kind of group projects, right? Like actually building something together with other men and working together with other men. I think a lot of men really struggle with that because they think everything's gonna disappoint them. So working up in intensity, starting something very easy that like, okay, if they don't catch you, you're fine, right? Like you're not gonna die. And then slowly building up so that, yeah, those things will hurt more and more if people disappoint you. But that's part of being in reality versus being in fantasy. The idea that people are imperfect. And that's hard for a lot of men because I think we want to be perfect. Who doesn't? Who doesn't want to just like crush it all the time and be kind of like the Terminator robot that just never stops and just nails everything, right? Like, but that's not reality. A lot of men live in that fantasy, and we're told to live in that fantasy of like having all the answers all the time and being able to fix everything all the time. And that's
Yeah.
way too much pressure.
Yeah. It's almost like that idea of rupture and repair.
Hmm.
We, as men, often women, we think that relationships have to be perfect. It's like everything perfect. And actually, no, a normal relationship is you rupture, mess up, but then you repair. And it's like that's normal. And I can remember having this conversation with my wife a few years ago and going, oh, we're having a, a conflict. She says, no, this is normal part of it. I'm like, oh yeah, of course. This is good. And she's like, yeah, this is great. This is how we grow. So it's almost like that trust. Yeah, someone might drop me and then I repair.
Yeah. And I think women are so much better at that in many ways. Like, I think I see a common dynamic in male female relationships, right? It's just what you said is like the man, and me included, I'm also like this with my wife, is like we just want it to be good all the time, right? We want it to be happy all the time and minimize drama and just be stable. Whereas women, they want all of us, right? And they want the ugly parts and they want the shitty parts and they want the childlike parts and they actually feel more connected to us, right? When they see us cry or when they see us get angry. Of course, as long as we're not hurting them, right? But like with the more of us they get, the more fulfilled they get. They're much more holistic, I think, than we are. And there's some biological reasons for that. A lot of it's also, cultural conditioning. But as men, we have to learn that like they want those ugly parts, and that by keeping those parts away, we're trying to protect them, but we're just doing them a disservice. And I think it actually, whole other topic, but it leads to a lot of divorces because women feel like they're not dating humans. They feel like they're dating robots or they're dating, cardboard cutouts, and then they leave. You know, they actually
Mm.
want the pain and the sorrow and the anger and the insecurity, which as a man, it's like insane to think of because we don't want those parts in ourselves. So why would anybody else want them?
Mm. But it's that authenticity, isn't it? It's that vulnerability. It's like that's the true you, that unconscious, which is kind of presenting itself anyhow.
Yeah.
But when we can make it conscious, it's like, yeah. So if a woman is listening to this and their partner uh, is struggling and but they won't do anything about it, what would you suggest? Say if it's a woman, a man, and the man is not wanting to look at his stuff, what
Yeah.
would you suggest?
So, I mean, that's a tough one. So I think if the guy doesn't want to do any work, right, and it's a female partner, I think trying to present a clear mirror is very important, right? Because I think, I guess I'm gonna pause on this because I think strong men want feedback. I think we crave feedback. And I think because of, male privilege, I think because of male intimidation, because of conditioning, we don't get a lot of clear feedback. We get a lot of people that dance around our feelings and are afraid of our feelings. So we don't know when we're fucking up. We don't know when we are, what the impact that our behavior has on other people. So I think for the female partner, as compassionately as possible, because if it comes off as, nagging or as critique, the guy's just going to get defensive. But being like, hey, this is what's like to be in a relationship with you, right? This is the impact. I feel alone in our relationship. I feel like you push me away. I feel like my opinion doesn't matter, that you shut me down. I feel like you're, more interested in being right than you are in getting to know me. Or these are kind of common things that come up, and saying it very clearly, very rationally, as much as possible, maintaining a calm voice, right? It doesn't have to be an argument or yelling, but just like holding up that mirror, I think is really helpful. Because what I've seen for guys is like it has to get really bad for us to seek treatment or to seek coaching. You know, Usually it does for the guys that see me. It's like they're on the verge of a divorce, they're on the verge, they're recovering from a drug addiction, they've lost their job, the kids have moved out of the house. It's like a crisis. So the idea is not to generate a crisis, but to bring that to their attention sooner rather than later, that like a crisis is coming. Because for the dissociative man, we're just going to keep trudging through like nothing's happening. We're pushing away everything. Um, so I think another tip for women that I also see as something is like, if your guy does start to go to therapy and he starts to open up, like have grace, because he's going to be really clumsy, like really clumsy. Like he's going to say stuff that probably is going to sound really mean or really blunt. He's going to say stuff that, isn't really that empathic. He's going to say stuff that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Because I think women, that's a blind spot for a lot of them, is that because they engage in so much emotional content, whether that's books or media, and they speak emotionally, their EQ is just naturally way higher than ours. So
Yes.
they're like, oh, when I talk with my girlfriends, the conversation goes completely differently. And I think they hold men to that really high standard in the beginning. So you have the guy that maybe is trying to express something to you, but is feeling shut down or feeling judged for like not doing it in the right way. So being the idea of like, hey, if he's going to come into your world, the world of emotions, you need to go into his world as well, and that's part of that kind of reciprocity that happens in a relationship. So yeah, it's like make it really shitty, hold up the mirror, and then have grace when he starts to open up would be the suggestions there.
Mm, That's fascinating and so important. I think it just kind of brought a memory of my wife doing that for me. And she also showed her emotion, as in she cried. And
Mhm.
as soon as she'd done that, I was like, oh my God, I'm really there. I'm listening. I'm going, this is how my behavior is impacting her. And therefore it was like, right, I'm listening.
Mhm.
That was always very powerful when she dropped into her feeling. And I'm like, oh, okay, I need to pay attention.
Now it's serious. Now it's serious, right? And yeah, I hope your wife was able to do this. Since she's a great woman. It's like having curiosity too, because I think when people are hurt, it can become blame and shame, right? And like you are doing this to me. You're a shitty husband. You're bad, right? Versus like if she's crying, being like, hey, this is how it impacts me, and like, where do you think this came from? Is this your family? Is this a trauma that you endured? Like I know this isn't the real you. I know that you're not a bad person, but this behavior is hurting me. And as a team, we need to understand what's going on with that behavior, you know, versus like pushing the guy away, which is hard. I think it's a lot of emotional labor on women's part, but I do think men often need a lot of that hand holding to be able to have the kind of conversations that women ultimately want us to be able to have. Talking about our childhood, talking about, conflicting emotions, talking about times where, our innermost thoughts, we need the guidance there because that's not normal for us at all, you know.
Mm, mm. Yeah, yeah. So we've been speaking, coming up for an hour.
Mhm.
Anything that you maybe, as we were preparing for this talk, you thought, oh, I'd love to bring this in, or that kind of really resonated, or a question, or something you wanted to share? Is there anything there, Mark, you'd wanted to talk about that you feel is
Yeah, I mean,
important?
I think we touched on it a little bit, but I was curious with the boarding school piece, right? Of like, are there places that are doing, and you just talked about a little bit, like that are doing male initiation right? Like a therapeutic summer camp or something, right? Or even a boarding school, right? Some kind of like educational thing, because I do think that's what the world needs, is it needs older men to shepherd younger men from these things that we've been talking about around EQ, right? And having
Mm,
values and living an honorable life, and these kind of nostalgic views of like chivalry or Bushido, or like these like kind of like codes that
mm,
I think existed in the past, but who knows what it was really like. It was probably in some ways probably just as corrupt and shitty as it is now. But I long for that. I long for an institution that I think would do it right. And I'm curious your thoughts, like, is that possible, or do you have hope for something like that, or how do we as an industry, this men's work industry, like
mm,
bring that to the world? Because I think that's what the young men
mm.
need,
Yeah, so I was part of a rites of passage last year,
right?
and for my godson, and but that's 10 boys in a
Mhm.
year that they initiate. So there are others that things like Journeyman, which works with 14 to 18-year-olds here in the UK, and I think it's the same charity in the US is called Boys to Men,
Mhm. Yeah, I'm familiar with them. Yeah.
which is quite big, and I think that came out of the Mankind Project. So the Mankind Project do initiation for men, but Journeyman, Boys to Men, they do initiations for boys. There aren't many. I mean, like for boarding school, I think boarding school is an initiation, but it's a really negative initiation. One, as I said earlier, it's not the adults who are doing the initiating, it's the children doing the initiating. And therefore, a child initiating a child, it means a child. It doesn't mean they step into adulthood. And I think it's really positive personally. I mean, my vision, as I share in most of my podcasts, is that boarding schools will close within 10 years. So they become obsolete because we move from command and control leadership into emotionally intelligent. So many companies now are taking that on board. I say this in most of my episodes of so many of the leadership Bibles, like Warren Bennis or Kuzen Posner or Jim Collins. They're all talking about love in leadership. They're talking about emotional intelligence. They're talking about relationships. These schools don't teach it, so they're just going to become obsolete. And therefore, I think to go away for a camp, a week, 2, 3 weeks, great, with a held space by adults, but then they come home again,
Hmm.
and then they're supported by a community of men or women.
Yeah.
But at the moment, they're taken away and they never return. And what that looks like in society is what we're seeing in the world now. We have a lot of boys and girls in charge of the world. And we can see that impact. So we want men and women in charge of the world.
Yeah.
Stewarding. I think there's a difference between that idea of steward. I'm in service. It's not mine. I don't own this. I'm here to serve. And I think that's really for me, the transition from immaturity, childhood into adulthood is right. I moved from a place of it's all about me. What can I get to service? How may I serve? What's the world need?
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think, yeah, the work that you do, the work that I do is like hopefully like meeting those childhood needs, doing that healing so that they're able to be stewards, right? And to be able to be of service. Because, yeah, I agree. I think that's what the world needs. It needs less ego and more collective community.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. And, you know, really enjoyed the conversation. And I feel like I've learned so much. Any final words that you'd like to share,
No,
Mark?
I mean, that's it. I enjoyed the conversation. I guess for guys listening, it's like take the plunge. I mean, check us out, check Piers out. Like, I think that there is a community that is here and ready for you. Right? Like I said, I think it is real. I think there's a lot of men that want to be mentors. There's a lot of men that, are in men's organizations, men's circles happen, things like the Mankind Project. Like it's here. It's here.
Mm,
It just takes that one phone call. It just takes that one step to join this kind of like belonging that so many men need. So that's the one thing I want to say to listeners is like, do it. Just do it. Just like pick up the phone and do it. You'll
mm.
thank yourself and you'll wish you had done it earlier.
Yeah. How do people find out more about your website?
Yeah, yeah. So
This
website,
place?
it's menstherapy.online. Everything is there. So yeah, we have our own podcast, we got blogs, we got free email course, we got all kinds of free stuff. And then if you do want to get involved with us, we do individual counseling, group, and retreats. We're based in Colorado, but we can see people all over the world virtually. So yeah, menstherapy.online is the hub for everything.
Mm, mm. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure meeting you today. And if I can support in any way, please do let me know.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise, enjoyed it.
Cool. Okay. Take care, Mark. Bye bye.